The Holy Gospel according to Mark, the 9th chapter.
Glory to you, Lord.
They went on from there and passed through Galilee. Jesus did not want anyone to know it, for he was teaching his disciples, saying to them, "The Son of Man is to be betrayed into human hands, and they will kill him. And 3 days after being killed, he will rise again." But they did not understand what he was saying and were afraid to ask him. Then they came to Capernaum, and when he was in the house, he asked them, "What were you arguing about on the way?" But they were silent, for on the way they had argued with one another who was the greatest. He sat down, called the 12, and said to them, "Whoever wants to be first must be last of all and servant of all." Then he took a little child and put it among them, and taking it into his arms, he said to them, "Whoever welcomes one such child in my name welcomes me, and whoever welcomes me welcomes not me, but the one who sent me." The Gospel of the Lord.
Praise to you, O Christ.
You may be seated. Particularly in Mark's Gospel, there is a pattern that gets set up where Jesus tells his disciples that he is going to be betrayed, and he's going to suffer, and he's going to be killed, and on the third day he's going to be raised again. These are called passion predictions by those folks who do that kind of Bible study and so forth. And in these passion predictions, particularly in Mark's Gospel, there is a pattern. And part of the pattern goes like this. Jesus predicts his passion, and then the disciples misunderstand completely. They just don't get it, and they act on their not getting it. They act on their not understanding. And then Jesus has a moment to teach them. So you get the passion prediction, you get the misunderstanding, and you get the teaching moment. And so last week we heard that pattern. We heard Jesus was hanging out with his disciples, and he asked them, "Who do people say that I am?" And they offered some of the answers about who people said that Jesus was. And then he said, "But who do you say that I am?" And they said, "Well, Peter said on behalf of the disciples, you are the Messiah." And then he predicted his passion. And in response, Peter pulls him aside. You may remember this, and says, "Oh, heaven forbid." Actually, we don't know in Mark's Gospel what Jesus said. All we know is that Peter rebuked Jesus, and Jesus said no. And then the teaching moment went something like this. "Any who want to be my followers need to deny themselves, take up their cross, and follow me." This week we hear Jesus again walking with his disciples through Galilee, and he's kind of trying to hide out because he's in the midst of teaching his disciples about what is going to be coming as they head towards Jerusalem. And in the midst of that, he once again predicts his passion, that he will be betrayed and he will be killed, and on the third day he will rise again. And the disciples didn't understand what he was saying, and they were afraid to ask for clarification. But even more so, as they went along the way, they argued among themselves about who was the greatest. And that led to a teaching moment where Jesus says, "Any who want to be first must be last and servant of all." In the midst of all of this, we hear this question, and in fact, as the staff of Zion Lutheran Church got together and we were doing Bible study together, there was this huge question of, well, how could they be so petty? They have just heard this. I think it's helpful to back up just a little bit because a lot has happened between that first passion prediction and the one that we hear today. And if we don't pay attention to what happened in between, it seems kind of odd that the disciples could be so foolish. What has happened in between is, as soon as they got done with that last passion prediction and the teaching that came after it, Jesus took 3 of the disciples and went up on a mountaintop. Peter, James, and John, you may remember, he took them up on a mountaintop, and there they saw Jesus transfigured. They saw him glowing. They saw him shining white. And more than that, there was Moses and Elijah there. It was a holy moment, and these 3 got to see it. Those other 9 were down below at the base of the mountain. They didn't get to see it. The law and the prophets were there. Pointers to the Messiah who was to come. Life was good for those 3. And then when they got down to the base of the mountain, what happened? But those other disciples had been presented with a father who had a son who was possessed by an unclean spirit. And that father had come to Jesus' disciples and asked that they pray for his son, expel that unclean spirit, and they were not able to do it. And the father, when Jesus comes along, the father says, if you're able, and Jesus says, well, of course I'm able. Just believe. And the father says, well, I believe, help my unbelief. And a little later, the disciples catch him and they say, why is it that we couldn't do this? And he said something about, well, some things can only come out by prayer. That's what happens just before this. We have 3 disciples who have this magnificent experience, and we have other disciples who apparently are failures. And so they're walking along the road, and in the midst of walking along the road, they come to this place, and Jesus is teaching them, and he tells them what's going to happen, but they still can't imagine what he's talking about. And so they go about their business. It's a classic thing among human beings to figure out who lines up where in pecking order. And so they went about doing that, figuring out who was first and who was second and where everybody lined up. Every family knows how this works. And just in case we think that somehow we have matured beyond that, I can tell you in my lifetime, in my experience, I recall the day when a whole bunch of people who had been significant leaders in their home churches showed up on campus at seminary. And it was an interesting thing to watch that class. It was my class. My class in seminary was notable because the youngest student was 22 years old and straight out of seminary, or straight out of college. And the oldest student was 62 years old and had been through at least 2 other careers beforehand, and according to most people's understanding, should be retiring before he's eligible to even serve in a congregation. And so we had that huge span of age. The mean, in other words, the average age, was right in the early 40s. Let me tell you, that class was a class that had all kinds of things going on, and there were all kinds of people who were used to being in positions of significant responsibility and leadership in their congregations. And when it came time to bring all those people who were leaders together, well, perhaps you've been in the room with a bunch of people who are leaders at home, and they're trying to figure out who's on first in whatever group they're in. Sometimes it can get kind of ugly. And it got a little ugly among my seminary class. It was kind of surprising. These are folks who are supposed to be following Jesus. And yet sometimes even today, disciples like me struggle to hear and to follow what Jesus is telling us. It is in the midst of this that Jesus says, the ones who want to be first, the ones who want to be way out there in the front, in the lead, recognized, have the authority and the power. Indeed, those people are called to be last and to be servant of all. And just in case it's hard to wrap our heads around, because it is hard to wrap our heads around, he takes a child. Now, the thing about a child is you've probably heard all kinds of things about what that means, but the reality is a child in that culture is probably the most vulnerable person in the culture. A child in that culture, I've heard one person say, that has about a 50-50 chance of surviving to adulthood. First of all, in that time, childbirth was a supremely dangerous thing. It could kill children, it could kill mothers. And if you got through childbirth, then there was all that disease out there. And diseases that don't even scare us today could kill you. And if childbirth and disease didn't get you, then the reality is there were a whole bunch of other ways in which life was dangerous. Children were easy to kind of overlook in that kind of culture. Easy to ignore. Easy to kind of say, well, let's just wait and see. Jesus takes one of those who is easiest to ignore and says, anyone who welcomes one such as this welcomes me. And when you welcome me, you welcome not just me, but you welcome the one who sent me. A messenger stands in the place of the one who sent them and speaks the words for that one. And when you receive the messenger, you're not really receiving the messenger, but you're receiving the one who sent that messenger. And what Jesus tells us is that we are called to pay attention to who the least are, who the ones are that are easy to ignore, who the ones are that we would, in fact, probably prefer to just keep outside the doors. It'd be easier that way. Those that our culture says aren't worth anything. And in fact, all we have to do is listen to the rhetoric that is out there in our culture, out there in our community, out there in our nation. Listen to the political conversation, and you hear very clearly who is valuable and who is not. And what Jesus does is he says, if you're going to be in leadership in the reign of God, if you're going to be in leadership in the kingdom of heaven, you need to be prepared for everything that you see and that the culture tells you is valuable to be flipped on its head. And those that you would so easily dismiss and ignore are the ones that you need to be servant to. Let go of your sense of power and authority and follow the good news that God is lifting up for you. And when we enter into that, when we enter into discipleship that allows all of that to be turned upside down and enter into being servants of the least, then we get a glimpse of the reign of God, the kingdom of heaven that has come near.